And I want to thank you all for your time and attention in participating in today's session. Today, we're going to be exploring the concepts of resilience and peace building. And we have queued up some fantastic speakers here for you today. My name is Swathi Veeravalli, and I'm with US Africa Command, and it's a US organization I'm actually based in Germany. And I have the pleasure of moderating today's session, which will not be too hard because, again, as I mentioned, we have some great panelists lined up for you today. So we'll give the chance to each of our panelists. We have four, about 30 to 40 minutes for them to present sort of their perceptions and concepts on environmental peace building and resilience. And then we'll open it up for question and answer. We will ask that you put your questions directly into the chat. And I will be assisted by Mr. Fabian Hoffman, who is helping us out from the Geneva Institute, who will be also my technical support. So thank you very much, Fabian. And then we will have sort of an opportunity for a quick round sort of summary discussion at the very end, and that should take us to our 90 minutes that we have with you all today. So I do want to remind you all that we are looking forward to a conference characterized by mutual respect and collaboration. And just as a reminder that a requirement of the conference registration procedures is to read and to agree and abide by the NPAC's anti-discrimination, harassment, and retaliation policy. And my colleague Fabian has also posted that information for you online. So we are here today to foster discussion and collaboration. And so we do ask that you do so respectfully. I will quickly introduce my panelists for you today. First, you will be joined by Mr. Steve Killelea, who is the founder and executive chairman for the Institute for Economics and Peace. Over the last 2 decades, Australian technology entrepreneur Steve has applied his business skills to his mainly global philanthropic activities, establishing the internationally renowned global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, and private family charity, the Charitable Foundation, which has over 3 million direct beneficiaries. He is also the creator of the Global Peace Index, which is the world's only quantitative measure of global peacefulness that covers over 99.7% of the world's population. Second, you will be joined by two panelists from SIPRI. First, we'll have Dr. Farah Hegazi, who is a researcher in SIPRI's Climate Change and Risk Program. Her research focuses on identifying and understanding climate-related security risks and shows how interventions to address the effects of climate change can be used to build peace. Dr. Hegazi is currently working on evaluating how climate-related security risks affect peacekeeping missions and how the World Food Programme's climate-related interventions can contribute to peace. Third, actually, you'll also hear from Ms. Elizabeth Smith, who is a research assistant with SIPRI's Climate Change and Risk Program. Her research focuses mainly on climate change and peace building and gender. Finally, you'll hear from Mr. Felix Shihundu, who is a master's student in international relations at the Social Sciences University in Turkey. He holds a BA degree in political science, conflict and peace studies from the University of Nairobi in Kenya, and previously worked as an intern in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the Secretariat of the United Nations in Nairobi. Felix is very passionate about the issues of climate change and environmental peace building, notably supporting works of multi-agency climate change committees comprised by both the UN and Kenya. So thank you to you all, and thank you to our distinguished panelists for being here today. I will turn it over to our first panelist, Mr. Killelea.
Great, thanks for that, Swathi. Now, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit sort of about resilience, then come down to some talk about what creates it, also come around, then talk about an ecological threat report, which we put out each year, which looks at the ecological threats facing 180 countries around the world. But I thought I might start with just looking at a simple definition of resilience. And so the way we'd see resilience, and we view it from a societal perspective, it's the ability to be able to withstand a shock, then recover from that shock and adapt so that the society is better capable of dealing with that shock if it happens again. So now, obviously, some societies will collapse under small shocks. Other societies need major real threats to really be able to cause them to collapse. But all societies can collapse. Just think of an asteroid hitting the planet, for example. A lot of people quite often think that resilience and sustainability are the same thing. They're very, very similar and they interlap a lot, but they're not. You can have a society which is quite sustainable, but if it gets hit with the right shock, then it will also collapse and not have the level of resilience needed. Resilience and systems are intermeshed. The two really, in many, many ways, are inseparable, because what creates the resilience is the system, or the societal system, which the country set within, or the society set within. So now, the Institute for Economics and Peace, we measure resilience through a thing called positive peace. Now, positive peace we derive from about 50,000 different data sets, indexes, attitudinal surveys, which we have down in Sydney. And so we have the Global Peace Index, which is the world's leading measure of global peacefulness. And so what we do is mathematical modelling and statistical analysis against those 50,000 data sets to find out which factors are most closely associated with peace. Now, what we do then is we use further analysis now to clump them together. And that comes out into 8 different clumps, which we call pillars of positive peace. And then we turn that back around into another index. And now the beauty of this index, it's not what I think, it's not what any of the researchers think, it's purely derived from the statistics and the mathematical modelling, which we do. And so it's sort of free of judgment in a lot of ways. But what's really interesting is we pull that together now and we find that it's really is correlated with a whole lot of things. So not only does it describe the factors which create a peaceful society, but it also describes a lot of other things which we think are important in life. So just to give you an example, so countries which are improving in positive peace on average have a 2% per annum higher GDP growth rates than countries which are deteriorating. We find a whole lot of other economic measures stack up similarly. So interest rates we find are much lower in countries which are improving in positive peace compared to countries which are deteriorating. In fact, they're sort of 6 times more volatile in countries which are deteriorating. You'll also find that measures of well-being and happiness are stronger in countries which are higher in positive peace. And you'll also find things like equal measures of the sustainability and measures on the ecology. They also are much higher in countries which are higher in positive peace than countries which are lower. And so also measures of inclusion, a whole range of other things. So in many ways, positive peace describes an optimal environment for human potential to flourish. And now, when we look at that in a little bit more detail, it's not that any one pillar matters, it all functions as a system. And so I'll come back to that systemic aspects just in a few minutes. Now, what I'd like to do now is just shift from sort of the way we go about viewing resilience to come over and now talk about the ecology. So we put out and we focus today, and climate change is very, very real. And it's going to be a factor which is going to exaggerate a lot of the issues which are existing today. But what I want to do is just focus in on a lot of the ecological threats today, because what we find is the countries with the worst ecological threats, what we can find is they've got a whole lot of systemic issues facing. It's not just one, it's many. And so it's important to be able to start to look to address these ones today. So, for example, if we look at the 15 countries with the worst score on the ecological threat register, 11 of them are actually in conflict. And the other four are actually on our watch lists. And so these ecological threats are systemic. You'll find that there are many, many things which go together with them. So you'll find a lot of the time there's very, very weak governance. You'll find very large increases in the population. You'll find there's not enough water to produce enough food to feed the people in these areas. You'll find quite often there's conflicts. You can find the Islamic terrorists in a number of the places, amongst other things, and you'll find conflicts and quite often generally high levels of crime. And that's just a few of the things, let alone poor business environments. So now, we now start to look at it in maybe a little bit more detail. So just to drive home this relationship again between ecological degradation and conflict, if we look at the 30 countries with the worst scores, what we find is 28 of them in the bottom half of the Global Peace Index. Now, what we do is use positive peace. We come back, combine it together so that we can actually understand hotspot, what we term hotspot countries. So they're countries with major ecological threats and very, very low levels of resilience. So we have 31 countries which fit into that basket. And of that, there's 1.2 billion people in the world living there. And these are the people most at risk of having to, living in a place with systemic collapse and then having to migrate. So 3 different belts. The first one's in Sahel, the Horn of Africa, running from Mauritania to Somalia. Second one's Southern Africa, that's Angola to Madagascar. The third's the Middle East to Central Asia, Syria to Pakistan. So now if we looked at the world globally today, we find that 2.3 billion people, that's 30% of the population, are actually food insecure. And that's up 44% since 2014. And if we look at it, 2 out of every 3 people in sub-Saharan Africa face food insecurity. And that's the worst place of anywhere in the world. Now, I'm just going to keep focusing in on sub-Saharan Africa. I'll talk for another 2-3 minutes probably, and then I'll be done. So if we look at it also in sub-Saharan Africa, there are 17 countries which are likely to double their population in the next 30 years. That's to 2050. Niger is the one which is most likely to, Niger is the country with the largest projected population increase at 161%. But if we average this right across sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find that 90%, the population by 2050 is expected to increase by 90%. So now that's truly unsustainable. And climate change is just going to exaggerate a lot of those issues much, much further over the next 30 years. So now if we look at it, and from the analysis we do, the Sahel is probably the most stressed area in the world. So we're in the process of putting out a global terrorism index at the moment. And we can see just from that, when we'll release that in about another 6 weeks, that the Sahel is going to have the largest increase in terrorism of anywhere in the world in the last year, in fact, over the last 3 years. And so this comes back to describing sort of the systemic issue. So if we look into the Sahel, okay, what we find is, one, is you've got a lot of the conflict going on, a lot of terrorist groups. You've got a lot of population displacement. You've got really weak governance, very poor governance. In fact, 3 of the countries have had coups in the last 8 months. You've got lack of water. You've got large population growth. That lack of water means there's a lack of food. Now, what I want you to think about, these all come back to the systemic nature of the societies. So the countries which are high in positive peace, none of them have these kind of ecological issues because they've got the countries generally generate the wealth they need. They've got low population growth. Through the wealth they need, they can capture the water they need, which means they can produce enough food. So now if we look at the way we're handling these problems, in the Sahel, for example. So we'll look at the United Nations. Great fan of the United Nations, but you have UNHCR looking after the refugees. You've got UN peacekeeping forces there, maybe about 14,000 currently. got UNDP, it'll be working on different projects, let's say WASH projects, for example, other development projects. You've got the UN Population Fund working on the population. You might have the IMF in there, the World Bank in there, which will be working on the governance and aspects to try and improve the governance of many of these countries. You might have IMF in there trying to improve the business environments and much more. These are all tactical approaches to a systemic problem. And unless we can really understand systems, we're never going to be able to get to the stage of really being able to understand how to even tackle these problems. And this is true globally for any of the societies in the world. So one of the things we've done, the Institute for Economics and Peace has developed a new framework, which we've just released in the last 2 weeks, for being able to measure systems, and that's called HALO. Why HALO? And that's because you can't really perceive a system directly. You can understand it through the data, you might understand it through surveys, you may understand it through anecdotal conversations, but it's very hard to perceive directly. So this technology we've built consists of 28 different building blocks. You can mix and match them to actually create a mixture of the way you want to do a systemic analysis. It's based on biology, and then from there it's been adapted to work with human social systems. And in many ways, this is really quite a revolutionary way of being able to perceive how to measure societies. But at this point now, I think I've run out of time, so I'll stop and hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Steve. That was really, really fascinating. And I know that I have tons of questions for you, but I'll save that for the Q&A after we go to our next speaker. So now you'll be joined by Dr. Farah Hegazi and Miss Elizabeth Smith.
Thanks so much, Swathi. I'll speak on behalf of Elizabeth for this, but we're both really happy to be here. I'm looking forward to talking to you about our research and to discussing in the Q&A. We are here to talk to you today about the gender dimensions of climate insecurity. This is based on research that has CIPRI research that hasn't been published yet, so keep an eye out because it will be coming out soon. But first, just to get everyone on the same page so that there's a sort of a common understanding of what we mean by climate insecurity or climate-related security risks. Essentially what that is the security risks that arise from the effects of climate change in terms of how it affects people's well-being and their livelihoods. And that may all have implications for social, economic, and political stability. So what it comes down to is trying to link climate change, human security, and deteriorating social or political stability. And there are lots of different, again, lots of repetition here, but there are lots of different social, political, and economic structures and dynamics that play a role in mediating that link between the effects of climate change and insecurity, which is why we use the term pathways. And with the research that's been done at CIPRI on this, we've been able to identify 4 pathways that connect the effects of climate change with insecurity. This doesn't mean that there aren't more, it's just that this is what we found so far. And those pathways are worsening livelihood conditions, migration and changing mobility patterns, the tactics of armed groups, and elites exploiting local grievances. So I'm going to explain each of those very briefly and then turn it over to Elizabeth to talk to you more about how gender plays into this. Now, when it comes to worsening livelihood conditions, this is really about how the effects of climate change affect people's or influence people's livelihoods, and in turn, how that can increase the risk of conflict. In a lot of places in the world, people's livelihoods depend on natural resources, which with changing temperature and changing precipitation patterns, there can be negative implications there. So once these livelihood conditions become worse, that can marginalize groups that are affected. And in turn, that can contribute to increasing grievances. And in the absence of any sort of alternative income sources, there is a risk that people can use violence to protect the resources that they already have. Of course, this isn't to say that the links are direct, but again, there are lots of other factors influencing this pathway from climate change to livelihood insecurity to violence, and that includes things like broader security trends, for example, the availability of small arms. Now, on migration and mobility, this pathway is about how, well, as it says, how climate change can affect migration and mobility patterns and what the security implications of that are. The conflict potential of climate-driven migration depends on the social, political, and economic context in the receiving areas, and that includes host communities' attitudes toward migrants. Now, in fragile or conflict-affected contexts, the tensions between migrants and host communities can become worse if, for example, customary mechanisms to resolve disputes are weakened or eroded, and there is no really other way to resolve conflict or mediate disputes. Another factor in this pathway is when you have diverse religious groups or ethnic groups that meet under sort of tense circumstances, especially where, as I said previously, host communities perceive that migrants are sort of having a negative impact on their livelihood insecurity. The third pathway that we've identified has to do with the tactics of armed groups, and this is mostly about affecting ongoing conflict. So while climate change can increase the risk of conflict breaking out, it also affects the dynamics of ongoing hostilities. And one of the ways by which it can do that is through recruitment into armed non-state groups. Now, the reasons why people join armed groups are incredibly complex, and we are in no way saying that climate change is the only reason why people join these groups. But what we found in our research is that the recruitment pool for armed groups can get bigger if people lose their livelihoods because of the effects of climate change. And again, there are no other viable alternatives for them to have an income. And then finally, on elite exploitation, this is essentially about how people in power can, when we say power here, this can be wealth, it can be privilege, it can be political power, so however broadly defined power. Sort of how they use that power to advance their own interests. And just an example of this, I think it's easier to illustrate through an example rather than explaining theoretically, but what we found with research in South Asia is in areas that experience floods or droughts, what elites have been able to do is occupy the land of people who have been displaced by these floods and droughts. And once these people have been displaced and the land has been taken over, what elites do is essentially they hire private militias to violently stop people from being able to return to their land. I'll stop there and I'll turn it over to Elizabeth, who is going to talk to you about the relationship between gender and these pathways. Elizabeth, over to you.
Thank you, Farah. Right, so as Farah mentioned, there's upcoming super research that will come out shortly that builds on a growing body of scholarship on gender, climate, and security. So, and this research will examine the gender dimensions of the pathways Farah has just provided an overview of. And so I'll give a few examples, including case studies of these different pathways. But before I do that, let's talk about a little bit why gender is relevant for understanding this. So gender can shape how different groups of people are affected by and respond to the effects of climate change and insecurity, both respectively and together. Recent research has also highlighted how gender can also influence or mitigate the likelihood of climate-related security risks. And when I talk about gender, and I'll use a definition from the UN's 2020 report on gender, climate, and security. I mean the social attributes, norms, roles, and attitudes considered appropriate for different groups of individuals by a given society at a point in time. And these are learned through socialization. Gender is a factor that shapes and reinforces power relations between and among these different groups. And other identity markers such as socioeconomic class, ethnicity, age, and disability, to name a few, can overlap with gender to create compounding inequalities for different individuals. So gender is among the factors that affect how people are affected by and respond to the respective and compounding impacts of climate and insecurity. And so now to get into a few case study examples that demonstrate how gender impacts risk and resilience in relation to the four pathways. So for the first one, worsening livelihood conditions, we can see that gender can influence the risks faced by different groups of people in relation to climate change, livelihood deterioration, and insecurity, but it can also influence their adaptation strategies. So to give an example, a study done in Western Sudan prior to 2011 highlights that conflict and drought were two factors that drove men in agricultural communities to migrate away from their households and families in search of work. So female farmers who remained behind play an incredibly significant role in household food production and procurement. And they then became the main breadwinners for their households after the men migrated. And so on one hand, gender inequalities did challenge their ability to adapt to drought conditions and deteriorating livelihood conditions, as they were disenfranchised from accessing credit, among other resources that would have helped them adapt to their circumstances. However, the women at the heads of their households also used a number of tactics, including relying on traditional knowledge to access wild foods, using social networks with other women, and diversifying their livelihoods from agriculture into trade, for example, to ensure food access and livelihood access for their families. And so now on to the second pathway, migration and mobility. Here I will highlight how gender can influence the occurrence of climate-related security risks. So Farah discussed pastoralist conflicts in the pathway, in her pathway discussion. And there's some research that indicates how gender can influence how and why different men and women may participate in these conflicts. So in certain contexts, young men, cattle raiding may be considered a mark of manhood, and a dowry is usually required to marry. And in some cases, women in their communities may encourage men to participate in these raids, as they will also profit from them as well. So gender norms and expectations within communities may contribute to increased risk of insecurity. So on to the third pathway, armed group tactics. Gender may also influence why different men and women may join armed groups in settings affected by climate change. So in one study on the Lake Chad Basin, for example, climate pressures and insecurity have interacted to impact the livelihood security for many people. This can, in some cases, prompt some young men to join armed groups to gain an income, which then allows them to realize traditional conditions of adulthood, including acting as the head of household as a provider. And conversely, some women, young women would also join these groups, assuming they may get access to certain opportunities like promised education. And then finally, elite exploitation. So I will take a slightly different angle on elite exploitation than what Farah identified. So on one study on Bangladesh, elites were noted to capture land as an unintended consequence of inequitable climate adaptation efforts. These dynamics then contributed to increased inequalities within and between communities. So for example, those displaced due to climate disasters, they then may have to labor on the land of elite actors in exchange for food, shelter, and security. And then within these different groups, gender impacted how different individuals coped with displacement. So gender, for example, could influence increased workloads for women who were traditionally responsible for organizing different household affairs, including infrastructure and gardens for their home bases. And so with that, I'm going to conclude the discussion on case studies of gender and the identified pathways, and just underline it with the fact that it's important to not only take into account gender in examining and addressing climate-related security risks. It's also important that any and all affected demographics are put at the table to equally and meaningfully participate in making decisions about how to address and mitigate these risks. And that's where I'll stop and turn it back. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentations. I will move straight into my presentation, which reminds us of the challenges the developing countries face in the field of climate diplomacy. I'll share my screen and quickly take you through some 7 or 6 slides. So the developing countries, as you all know, according to the World Bank and the UN definitions, these are countries that are characterized by low income levels. So I'll not go into the definitions, I'll just quickly go into what they face, the problems they face when they try to act in the area, in the sphere of climate change. So climate diplomacy is not a new concept. It's something that has been there, but only that now we are trying to act with the emergence that it deserves. It is actually calling on all countries and other states to include the agenda of climate change into their daily contract of bilateral and multilateral international affairs. It's a kind of an innovation into the conduct of daily diplomatic affairs. Developing countries face a lot of challenges when it comes to climate diplomacy because of some unique challenges that I will quickly go straight to them. Because of number 1, finance. Finance is a big issue, like all forms of diplomacy, it comes with a cost, and the developing countries, they don't have enough resources, enough finances. There are also pledges for developed countries to support the efforts of developing countries, but these are not sustainable means, they are not enough, and sometimes these pledges go unrealized. Another issue is an issue of policy. Policy is very important. Policy formulation and the policy implementation, all of them are very important when it comes to the developing countries acting. Most of them do not have good policies in place. Most of them face challenges in policy formulation, even in coming up with measures from the grassroots to tackle climate change. Another thing is the institutional framework. In terms of institutions, mostly is the research institutions. You know how much research means for climate change efforts. You need quality data, you need research to be able to to feed into the climate change agenda research to be able to help you make decisions that will be able to determine the future. So one of the issues that these countries face is the issue of having credible or institutions that are able to handle this enormous work. Another thing has to do with the issue of capacity in terms of the human resources. A lot of research and information on climate change has actually come from developed countries, and some people may tend to think, will it be any different if it came from the scholars or the capacities that are coming up in the developing countries? So you find developing countries not having the personnel that are required, the technical personnel that are required to be able to carry out the climate diplomacy effectively and with the efficiency that it deserves. Another challenge has to do with technologies. Developing countries face enormous difficulties and challenges when it comes to accessing technologies that are required to handle climate change emergencies. Some of these technologies are very useful, especially for instance, like moving from fossil fuel to renewable energies. You need technology to be able to tap into the new energy spheres that are actually important for our environment. So technology remains a big barrier, a big problem when it comes to developing countries accessing and being able to dialogue and negotiate at the multilateral level. The last challenge has to do with the interesting mix of science and politics. It has become almost difficult to be able to address the issues of climate change away from politics. There is what we can refer to an infodemic. It's a thin line between science and politics that makes it interestingly difficult. Sometimes it makes it look like tackling climate change is a contest between developing and developed countries, which is not. So why do we need climate diplomacy? We need climate diplomacy to be able to build trust, to be able to build confidence, and to be able to bring all the stakeholders to the table to dialogue and come up with the solutions for the future. We also need climate diplomacy to be able to unlock ambition. Climate ambitions require huge commitments. They require enormous resources. They require critical thinking. We need to be able to talk together, sit together, dialogue together, negotiate, so that we can be able to unlock ambitions of all of us at the table, not just a few of us that are able to secure interest. That leads us to the final point. This list is no way conclusive, but the final one is to be able to secure interest for all of us. Because if you look at the current state and the imbalances between developed and developing countries, it's very difficult for developing countries to secure interest in the table for climate diplomacy. So if we have climate diplomacy, it becomes possible for all of us, developed and developing states, to be able to secure interest for all, both now and for the future generations. So last year, look at diplomacy and resilience. How is climate diplomacy helping us to build resilience for our climate? Number one, it helps us to step up our adaptation efforts, to be able to focus on saving our environment, focus on bringing sustainable resources into use, and moving into a future that is actually guaranteed for all of us. Another one is being able to balance interests. You realize that in climate diplomacy, one has to give up something for the other. And I think this is one of the best forms of diplomacy, because we are all giving up something for ourselves. It's not giving up something for the other. Something else that helps us build resilience is an issue of being able to build sustainable governance institutions and moving into sustainable economic development models and methods that are able to work very well and move us into a sustainable future that we all are looking forward to. I will stop here and look forward to your contributions, comments, and probably questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Felix. And thank you also, Dr. Hegazi and Ms. Smith. I really enjoyed hearing all of your presentations. While I won't summarize everybody's very eloquent presentations, I do want to just sort of share with you what my immediate takeaways were. So in Steve's presentation, I really understood and he underscored the importance of interconnectedness within a system and how risk can manifest itself because of those interconnections. Dr. Hegazi and Ms. Smith really focus on understanding the response and coping mechanisms at various scales, at the subnational scale and at the country scale, as it perpetuates conflict or could perpetuate conflict and subsequently impact resilience. And Mr. Shihundu's presentation, I think at the very end, really focused on understanding why access to resources is really critical as we again try to unpack and understand how best to achieve resilience if that is indeed an end state. So thank you all for that. I do have a couple of questions from our panelists. So before I open it up to them, I would like to take the liberty as moderator to ask my question first and for all of our panelists. And my question specifically is, and I think if you could just mute yourselves, thank you. If you could please briefly define what resilience means to you, and from a timing perspective, how best we can achieve resilience in the next 2 to 5 years. I know that my question seems problematic, and that's exactly why I wanted to ask it, because I'd like, when I attend these types of conferences and symposiums, sometimes I walk away a little bit overwhelmed with the amount of information, and sometimes it's really helpful to know what activities, you know, what we can do about various issues that we identified. So I'll ask our panelists in reverse order. So I'll ask Mr. Shihundu to go first, and then Ms. Smith, Dr. Hegazi, and then over to Steve. Felix, you're muted.
Thank you so much. I think quickly to just point out from where I am, I think resilience for me, it means being able to build sustainable institutions and being able to develop sustainable models of finance and basically adapting to the use and the living and every mode of our life that it takes care of tomorrow, so that whatever that is depleted today can actually be available tomorrow for the future generations to use.
Thank you, Felix. That was a great answer. Farah or Elizabeth?
Tall order, Swathi. I mean, the definition of resilience, this is something that we struggle with when we're doing our research. Like, what do we mean? How do we define it? I think very, you know, at the sort of basic level, it's what Steve had mentioned, or the definition that he had used in his remarks, that it's your ability to cope with and come back after experiencing some sort of negative shock. What can we do in 2 to 5 years? Another tall order. I mean, I don't have the answer for that. I think it depends on resilience for whom, where, what sort of groups you're targeting. Are you looking at farmers? Are you looking at pastoralists, urban areas? So I'm throwing more questions out there than giving you answers, but that's sort of what's going through my mind right now. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Sure. Yeah, I think I would build off of that and stress the point about resilience for who. So, I mean, if you're, if you're taking a country approach to resilience, but, how are you taking into account the different groups of people, the different individuals and their experiences on the ground? And also, how are you making sure that they're at the table to define broader understandings of resilience and how to go about getting there? Because if you don't have that diversity of perspectives, I would question the efficacy of any resilience initiative as well. And I think I'd add with that.
Thank you both. I know it was a tall order, but really appreciate your answers. Steve, over to you.
Sure. So resilience to me is the ability to be able to withstand a shock. I think the first thing you need to do is understand what are the types of shocks which you want to have resilience against. Once you understand what are the types of shocks you want resilience against, you need to understand what is the level of the shock which you want to build resilience against. And then if you're looking at 2 to 5 years, societies change slowly, like they really do change slowly. So 2 to 5 years, all I think you can do is look at how can I put it, there's the adaptation if you actually get hit with one of these shocks, which is excessive to the system. And how do you build the capabilities to be able to sort of do disaster preparedness for the shock? You can do disaster preparedness. Being able to withstand it is something else. Again, that takes time.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. I really enjoyed hearing your specific perspectives. I know, again, it was a hard question to answer, but I think your points are super well taken. Resilience for whom? At what scale? Do we understand the system? These are all really, really important reminders as we understand that resilience is a super complex concept. Again, and understanding that at which scale and for whom is really, really critical. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our audience. I will ask the questions from our audience members, and I will take them in order of who they were asked for. So the first question that I have for all of you is an interesting question about religious conflict and how we prevent, how we could seek to prevent genocide. And I do ask to frame this question a little bit more in terms of resilience and understanding your specific presentations. How do we really conduct sort of resilience building or peace building activities in order to address the religious conflict? So I may start by asking our colleagues from CIPRI, and then we'll turn it over to Steve and then Felix.
Sure. So let me preface this by saying I am not an expert in religious conflict or ethnic conflict, but some of the research that we published last year, this is in relation to environmental peace building and trying to understand how environmental peace building works. One of the mechanisms that we identified was increasing contact between groups on opposing sides. So generating dialogue, showing people that they have common interests so that they can work together to achieve a better outcome. Yeah, I'll leave it at that, but Elizabeth, happy for you to come in.
I don't think I have anything more to add than your intervention there.
Great, an opportunity for Felix or Steve if either of you want to answer. If not, then just you can wave your hand and we can go to the next question.
Sure, I'm quite happy to say something. So we've done a reasonable amount of research on this at different stages. So I think you've got to look at the context of where these things are occurring, and what our research would say that sort of conflict is involved in something like, religious is involved in something like 60% of conflicts, but generally it's only one of the many other factors as well. And then religion tends to get used and pulled in around those factors. So if we look into the West, I think one of the more interesting things in the West, let's say in relationship to religious terrorism, for example, that's on the decline. What we're finding is that left-wing and right-wing terrorism is much more prevalent in the West now than religious terrorism. That's been the case now for the last 3 years, including 2021. So we're coming back and we're now going into other areas. Generally, you'll find that there's a lot of group, where there's conflict, you'll generally find there's group grievances. A lot of those group grievances can be along religious lines. They'll also be associated with an equitable distribution of resources and related to imbalanced power structures and other such things. So we spent a lot of time looking at Sunni and Shia divides, and there are many countries where you've got the same mixes, Sunni and Shia, of what you've got in Iraq, for example, or Syria, but they're highly peaceful countries without any real religious fighting. So a lot of the time, in our mind anyway, it comes back to the background conditions. So if you went up into the Sahel at the moment, Islamic terrorist organisations are on the rise, and that's because of the power vacuum up there. And and a lot of the time, what we're finding is that there's a lot of criminal gangs now, which are now taking up the mantle of being an Islamic jihadist group, because it gives them justification for their criminal activities. So a lot of the times you've really got to look into the individual situations to truly understand them.
Thank you so much. Felix?
I believe this question of religion, conflict, and genocide requires expertise. But I can quickly comment that in terms of preventing genocide, we've learned that genocide is not something that just happens. It involves planning, it involves organizing, it involves removing humanity into from the targeted party. So I believe if we can be able to open channels of communications, be able to build trust among religions, and basically encourage sharing of ideas, information, and build this general understanding among religions, we can be able to stop genocide at the earliest stages before it develops. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your perspectives. Now I'm going to ask a question, probably in the same order for our panelists. There's a question about armed group tactics and whether or not the inclusion of non-state actors can sort of affect the composition of armed group and how they use tactics to achieve their end states. And the question is really about the role of state armies and how they play in impacting resilience. And I'll caveat this by saying at a specific country. So maybe to our colleagues again in CIPRI, and then in the same order. Thank you.
Sure, Elizabeth, would you like to come in on this?
I mean, broadly speaking, the armed group tactics would include more than non-state actors as well. I don't have much more detail. If that answers the question. The question was, do armed group tactics only include non-state armies? Is that correct?
Yeah, that was my understanding of the question. And maybe, I mean, the example that I used was for non-state groups. But if I remember correctly, there was an example where I think it was either the Sudanese or the South Sudanese army, where recruitment was also going up because of these livelihood effects. So the short answer is no, it's not limited to non-state groups. It also includes military actors.
Great, thank you. Steve and then Felix.
Can you just repeat the question again? I'm going to let us see. a little bit lost on it. Just repeat it again.
The question is, armed group tactics only do armed group tactics only include non-state armies? The question is, do state armies not play a pathway in connecting climate change and security?
Yeah, still a bit confused on the question, but so certainly sort of if you look at it in well, it depends on the state actors. If you're looking at terrorism and you're doing measures of terrorism, that only includes non-state actors. You don't include state actors in that. However, if you're looking at state-sponsored terror, then that's a different way of being able to capture the other side of the what's being performed by states. But depending again on the span of control, levels of corruption, in many places the state actors are the ones which actually create a lot of the time the lawlessness, because they're quite often corrupt, quite often brutal, and that then gives the ability for non-state actors to be able to arise. Sahel, which is something we've been looking at quite a bit lately, the classic example there, and particularly when the state apparatus is weak and it's got very, very strong military presence, and when that military presence is indiscriminate on who it targets.
Great, thank you so much. Felix?
Thank you so much for this question. It's very interesting. But quickly to comment, I think the tactics of armed groups and the tactics of regular armies, or basically the warfare today, is still largely non-sustainable in terms of what they use. Because if you look at even in terms of the weaponry, whatever they use in the battlefields, it's not good for our environment at all. Maybe, I don't know if there is anything like moving forward to sustainable warfare. I don't know, but what they use now is not sustainable. It does not help our climate. It does not help our environment, whether it's armed groups or the regular armies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Felix. Yes, your points are well taken, and I think that global militaries are trying to understand if they can at least decrease their operational footprint as sort of net consumers of energy. I don't know if that gets at sustainable warfare. That's probably a question for a longer conversation. So now there's a question for Steve, and the question was posed in chat, and I hope you had a chance to read it because it is quite lengthy, but if you haven't, I will read it for you. Let's see, so excuse me. They want to know about the limits of resilience in a closed loop system of any country, and understanding how country-based indexes are able to account for the role of exploitative transnational capitals, militarized international interventions, and basically the question is about heterogeneity within a state. And they're asking if you could comment on how you can understand the limitations of a country-based index. And that's from Dr. Ryan in the Netherlands.
Sure. Okay, so we basically, a lot of the indexes we do are country-based. The reason we do that because it's something which most people can relate to. We do a lot of other indexes which go down to much lower levels. So let's say we do country indexes, for example, which go down and look at the states. In the case of the UK, might go down to the borough level. So from memory, there were 600 and something boroughs there. We did one there. The Ecological Threat Register and the Global Terrorism Index, we've got them geocoded. So we've got the ability to be able to go down to the district level and look at the level of stress, which is related to, let's say, food or water, right through, let's say, areas like the Sahel. So we've got those areas there, but we tend to put them out, the indexes out, at the country level, because that's what people relate to. Now, obviously, if you're looking at the ecological issues, climate issues, they don't understand borders. And certainly when you're looking at a whole lot of ethnic groups, they don't understand borders either. They just see their ethnic group, and you'll see that in many parts of the world. Now, if you're coming from a systems perspective, okay, and let's say we're using Halo to do a systemic analysis, the first thing we do is describe the boundaries of the system. And like that depends on what type of system is. So if it's a geographic system, that's a pretty easy thing to do, but that doesn't have to be around, let's say, a country borders. Quite often you could have it spilling over the country, so we can have it as a subsection of a country going down to as small as you like. When you're looking at a system, it doesn't matter what the system is, there's no such thing as a closed system or a closed loop. Okay, that doesn't exist. So systems are porous to some degree. Okay, and some systems are a lot more porous than others. So quite often, country is a boundary for systems, not bad. Okay, and it does interface with a whole lot of other countries. So you have inputs coming in from those countries, and then you'll have outputs going out of your system into other countries, as well as it going into, let's say, the environment, which in this case, we're talking climate change, could be CO2. So it's important to understand the relationships and the flows from your system into other systems. But there's, in our view anyway, there's no such thing as a closed system. Systems also consist of other systems, and the system you're studying is also part of a super system. So you can think of, let's say, that could be a family unit within a society. That family unit could be part of a healthcare system. That healthcare system is part of countries, part of a state system. That state system is part of the ecosystem on the planet. And our planet is part of the solar system, which is, and we can keep on going. I'll stop there.
Thank you. I think, yes, I think the system of systems approach is something that I've tried to understand and failed every time. So now I'll open with a question for our colleagues from SIPRI. Farah and Elizabeth, there's a question from Sandra Valencia, who's a researcher and freelance and climate change consultant. She wants to know if you can please differentiate between climate variability and climate change as part of your research, and whether or not that makes a difference. The second part of her question is, have you looked at the impacts of different climate hazards on conflict and gender, and really to understand how those trends can affect different groups or different pathways depending on the hazard, and how the response could be from those perspectives. Over to Farah and Elizabeth, please.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sandra. On climate change, distinguishing between climate change and climate variability, again, this is something that we struggle with, and so what we tend to use is the IPCC definition of climate change, which includes both change and variability, so it gives us a bit more flexibility in our analysis. What we've found sometimes in the interviews that we do when we collect our data is those two tend to get conflated when we speak with people, which is understandable. I mean, they're not climate scientists. They're just talking about what they experience. And so it's up to us to sort of add the analytical lens to it. If we're using any quantitative data, we tend to use climate change rather than climate variability. So in looking at like temperature and precipitation trends over time, it tends to be change rather than variability. Elizabeth, over to you.
Sure. So for the second part, have you looked at the impacts of different climate hazards on conflict and gender? No, not categorically, if I'm understanding that question correctly. But in terms of whether there are some trends in different groups or different pathways, depending on the hazards they are exposed to and how to respond in a gender sensitive manner. Off the top of my head, I would say that, there is research, say, if we're talking about climate change and migration, there are going to be, depending on the group of people, the geography they're in, and the type of disaster, if it's slow onset, if it's sudden onset, different groups of men and women are going to be able to respond differently or be impacted differently by the variations of different hazards. And so, yes, to sum up, no, we haven't looked at that categorically, but depending on geography and the type of hazard, there's a likelihood that it would be different. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to Felix for a question from from Alex Maitenka, who works in the UK Department for International Trade. He wants to know, Felix, if you see any immediate opportunities to improve developing country participation in climate diplomacy through existing multilateral or regional organizations. So an easy one for you. No, it's not.
Thank you so much. It's not an easy question. I think I looked at it and I think it's not supposed to be for me, but let me try and give the following thoughts. I think with the existing structure, I think the opportunities rather are very small, but if you, I believe some of you have read the Secretary General of the UN's Common Agenda report, where he suggests or he recommends that we should be having a conference of the future. And one of the things I'm excited about this conference of the future is that we will be able to imagine a world where all of us, maybe the developing and the developed countries, will have equal chances and equal opportunities. But things as they stand now is very, the opportunities is small. That's what I have to say. It's very small. But with the things like enlarging representation, increasing representation, maybe at existing frameworks can do some help. But I'm hopeful with the conference of the future. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you so much, Felix. And I know that was a difficult question. I really appreciated your answer. We have a question from Mana, who's a climate and conflict advisor from the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. She wants to know what is our capacity to and tools to respond to risks on the ground between climate change, conflict, and security. She acknowledges the silos between peacebuilding organizations, institutions, tools, but really but underscores the lack of visibility and the lack of consideration and fragility and conflict sensitivity across various institutions, and really how to bridge that gap. I will open it up to, maybe I'll go in reverse order. Steve, I'll start with you.
So for me, it's a great question, and it's one yeah, we think about a lot. So for us, we've got to start with really understanding the systems we're trying to work on, understand the way they operate and work. Once you can understand the system, you can now start to think of what might be the systemic changes you need. And then once you understand that, you then design your institutions to be able to work in such a way that they now address what those systemic changes are you need to make. That's very, very different to the way we operate. Like this leads into a very, very deep philosophical question around empiricism and the study of the physical world, which is the way most of all our institutions operate, including our universities. They've sprung out of the study of the empiricism, the study of physics, study of systems very, very different. The whole principles are different. So it's what I see as a very big task. I think one of the ways of being able to tackle it is being able to look at small areas, do systemic studies for them, but you need to ask what is the problem you're trying to solve first, do the systemic study on it, then try and build an integrated approach around it. And so that really means bringing together many different multilateral organisations, the overseas aid development organisations. It also means bringing together the local governments and especially the local people, okay, and sort of being able to, in many ways, sort of bring them in and empower them in the dialogues as well, because they're just as much part of the system. So yeah, anyway, that's what I see. We've got a long way to go before we're actually in a position to even really be able to start to talk about systemic change sensibly. That's my sense. The frameworks for understanding societal systems are just in their very early days.
Thank you, Steve. I want to give our Felix. Do you have any ideas or thoughts on that? Okay, Farah or Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts on responding to that question?
Yeah, sure. I can put in my 2 cents on this. I agree with you, Mana, that it's still very much a siloed approach to addressing these issues. And this is something that we also find in our research, and it tends to be a problem because, I mean, precisely because the links between climate change and conflict are not siloed. And I hope what we've been able to get across with these pathways is that there is a lot that plays into this, which means that how we address it, there needs to be a lot involved in how we address it. On your question on finance, finance remains siloed. I'm thinking of this from sort of the donor perspective. Often donors will say, I want the money to be spent on like a WASH project or an adaptation project. And it's fine, it's their money, right? They can do and ask for whatever they want to, they can do whatever they want with it. But at the same time, I think we need to think a bit more broadly about how that money is used and what it's put into. And again, systems are slow to change, as Steve said, but I don't really think we have that much time to change the system.
Thank you, Farah. Elizabeth?
I agree with Farah on that. And I think, I mean, this wasn't the direct question that she asked, but I think I could just add to it that if we're talking about, say, gender, climate, and security, there are also silos between, say, gender and peace building work and then gender and climate work as well. So I think, yeah, there are a number of very relevant thematic aspects that should be bridged, and I think there is work being done on that. But yes, it's still relevant to address the silos there.
While I have you both on sort of on the hot seat, there's a question from Uli Beck, who was fascinated to hear how the worsening livelihood conditions impacted women and men differently. So really understanding the nuanced gender sort of equity and responses to climate change. They want to know, being a bit of a devil's advocate, how is there any potential for climate change to increase women's resilience? And I'd also be curious on that. I know we focus a lot on sort of the security implications and sort of the negative, but also what are the opportunities that climate change offers? So Farah and Elizabeth, I'll start with you, and I would love to hear Felix and Steve's insight as well.
I can jump in just a moment. I'm just rereading the question. I think, so being a bit of a devil's advocate, is climate change increasing women's resilience? I think I would first clarify that question is if it means like increasing resilience to climate change more broadly, to conflict, or what the increasing resilience to what? And then, but if we're taking it to mean is women's resilience improving in context of climate change? I don't know if I'd say anything's increasing or in that sense, and maybe it is, but that's not my area. But I would say women are resilient. If there's a situation in which climate change is impacting women's livelihoods, and gender inequalities can pose challenges to adapting to different circumstances. Women in different contexts consistently innovate different approaches to adapting to these circumstances for themselves and for their communities at large. Climate change, one thing that happens with climate change and gender dynamics is that in some cases it can sort of reshape gender dynamics. So that was discussed briefly in one of my examples, in which the out-migration of male community members put women in charge of their households as decision makers and breadwinners. And in some cases, climate change can lead to new opportunities and new roles for different groups of women, if that potentially answers that question. And then, yes, then the next part of that was reflecting on how gender-based violence is a factor or not in the pathways you mentioned. One thing that can happen in situations of climate and insecurity is different groups of women may be put at increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence if they need to travel further distances in insecure contexts, for example, to gather resources such as water or firewood. And I think I can stop there and pass it over to
Farah, do you want to add to anything?
No, nothing to add. Thank you.
Felix, do you have any insight?
I think I'll add something that climate change, as much as it's a negative thing, is something that we want to see come to an end. I think it also provides opportunities, mostly for everybody. But for this question, I think is for women. If I may give an example of where I come from, I think in terms of cooking, I'm sure now we are moving to clean cooking, but in terms of jobs and this an example of cooking, women are the ones who do a lot of kitchen work and cooking. And you find an example of where I come from, most of this job, they use cooking means which which are considered unsustainable. They lead to health problems, a lot of smoke. So with climate change, because it gives us an opportunity to look into what they are doing and they change it to sustainable means, it means we are going to save a lot more lives because they are now going to move into clean cooking. And generally, if you look at the jobs that we have now, I think, and the jobs that, many jobs that we have now, they are gendered in some way. So climate change gives us an opportunity to come up with the new jobs that are for everybody, and not taking into account the gender of anyone. So I think there are also opportunities here for resilience and moving forward. Thank you so much. Thank
you, Felix. Over to you, Steve.
I'll start with sort of resilience, maybe for women. Sort of none of this is new, but certainly the less children women have, the more resilient they're likely to be. Yes, if you've got 6 children, the ability to be able to go out and have a job and earn an income is very, very difficult, just because of the aspects of looking after the kids. So the lead on to that, for less children, is more time in school for girls. So, but that's nothing new. I think one of the things, you'll see, obviously the migration to the cities is something, but most of the people in our experience, in our studies and experience anyway, they're migrating to the cities. They're not migrating in terms of opportunity, they're migrating in terms of desperation. And a lot of the time they end up in slums, like Felix, for example, like Kariba scum. I spent quite a bit of time in them in Nairobi, and they're just the most unpleasant places in the world. So they get there and huge levels of unemployment, 50%. And now the men are trying to scratch a living out of that. And then quite often to send the money home to their families when they can. So I think that's a different gender perspective on that. One of the other areas where we've sort of done some work, and this is only preliminary work, I'll preface it with that's on thinness in Africa and the difference between thinness for men and women. And so in many countries, when you're looking at the thinness, it's measured as 2 standard deviations from the mean. You've got 20% higher levels of thinness in men than women. And so we're starting to look at that now and sort of that understanding, trying to get a better understanding of those levels of malnutrition, the effects it has on the brain, on the men, and then how that affects their relationships to violence and how hunger is a motivating force to go and join militias as well. So the opposite of that, okay, is women in that area obviously more resilient. We don't know the answers to this, but it may simply be they're the ones who cook the food, so they've got first access to the food. So I think down in these kind of environments, there's a lot more work we can do to really understand sort of really what's going on. I think particularly from a masculine perspective.
Thank you very much, Steve. And while I have you on the hot seat, there's a question that I'd like you to answer, and then I'll open it up to to the other panelists. A question from Michael Schroll, and this unfortunately will have to be our last question because we have about 7 minutes before the end of our session. So asking our panelists to be slightly brief in their answers. Where do you all see leverage to address climate security risks in fragile and conflict-affected, vulnerable, low positive peace score countries? Because climate financing is hardly accessible due to those reasons, Michael wants to know what is the entry point, and he's from the UN.
Mate, that's a great question. That's all I can say. In a difficult one. So for me, look, I think we've got to start to be looking at a massive number of micro projects which involve local communities. So quite often when we go in and we're sort of aiming at really quite big projects. And quite often those projects are siloed in their approach. So I think this need to be more systemic, but into very, very small areas and really engaging the local community. So if we look at a lot of it comes back to just really simple things. How can you capture water at a micro level and then from that produce food? Now that food then starts to go a long way, particularly in somewhere like Africa where you've got 2/3 of the population food insecure. But also, as you produce the food, you can now start to create micro businesses around it. And so then how do you finance, let's say, through cooperatives? And we've done these kind of things through my family foundation. They're very successful. Small, let's say, canning things to can or value-added processes, which you can put on out of a small co-op on the food which they make, and then have the ability to transport it to places where out of the local area they might get a better price. And so these kind of things are pretty simple, like just simple things like sand dams. We've done, I don't know how many, maybe 50, 70 of them now, but they're really cheap, $25,000 to $50,000 a dam. They last 50 to 100 years. And you can get up to, if it's a big one, up to 400 tons of produce out of it. So how do you sort of look at doing these things on a scale, on a massive scale, but in an entrepreneurial way? So that's not the solution. It's where I'm thinking anyway at the moment through my family foundation.
Thank you, Steve. And Felix, do you have any responses? Nope. Okay. Farah or Elizabeth, an opportunity for either of you? No.
I mean, on my end, not much to say, just that it's a great question. And what comes to mind for me is a holistic response, that addressing climate security is not just about adaptation or mitigation, but it's looking much more broadly at sort of the broader spectrum of development. So it could include things like improving both the access to and the quality of education, for example, because if you're talking about diversifying livelihoods as a way to address climate-related security risks, then you need to equip people with the right skills and know-how to be able to do that.
Thank you all. Thank you especially to our panelists. We have about 3 minutes left. So with the privilege of being a moderator, I would just quickly summarize everything. But before I do, I do again want to thank you all for your time and attention in participating. There's some great questions in the chat, which unfortunately we didn't have time to get to. A couple of participants have also added resources. So please do take a chance to check out the chat screen if you haven't had already. And I offer to our panelists, if there's follow-on questions, please put your email in chat if you would like people to contact you. Obviously, feel free not to do that if you don't have, if you don't want that. I did put my email in chat, so if anybody wants to continue any conversations, happy to entertain those. So just a quick summary. Resilience as a concept, from what I understand, is useful. It's perhaps not the best starting place, but it certainly opens the conversation, opens the door for conversation. And our panelists and our participants reminded us we have to be very specific when we're talking about resilience: to whom, for what, at what scale, geographically, and certainly temporally. And also, the second major point is really because of the global system that we live in. What happens at the very micro level can actually have huge macro and meso scale impacts because of the interconnectedness of both risk and resilience. And really, we need to adopt a systems of systems mentality when trying to unpack some of these things. And finally, the last point, which I think is for me the most important takeaway, is that response mechanisms to climate change or development or whatever your end state is will really depend on access to resources that are available to you, and really to acknowledge the importance of identity and diversity as they could impact that access, either increase or decrease that access. But really that we have an opportunity here today to address resilience and development, and really thanks to climate change. I think because of that, we're having these conversations, we're sort of addressing some of these silo mentalities that existed before between different institutions. But again, really climate change, I think, is really a converging, because of its converging nature, also an opportunity to address it in a systemic way. So thank you all for, again, your attendance. Just a reminder that we welcome you to join us for our upcoming plenary session, the Environmental Peacebuilding Awards and Dialogue, which is today at 1500 local time. And we look forward to celebrating our growing academic community with you all. I'll pause there, and then Fabian, if you have any other questions or comments for the group. Oh, okay. Thank you again for your time and attention. This is being recorded, and look forward to continuing the conversation throughout the course of the conference. Thank you.